Is everybody clicked in? I'm going to turn it off. Okay, I'm going to introduce competition. And what we're going to, again, whoa. Oh, yeah, I just updated. Whoops. Okay. So we're going to move on to, again, joint population dynamics. And what we're going to be moving towards now is interactions between species and interspecific competition. And if you think about outcomes, interactions between two species in a common environment, and assume they have some sort of shared limiting resource that, you know, it could be space or food or whatever it is, right? What do you think, what are the outcomes? What are the possible outcomes that can occur when two species are competing with one another? Yeah, one dies out, one outcompetes the other one and causes the extinction of the other, or vice versa. One species is, you know, so one is a better competitor, okay? What's the other outcome? Yeah, they coexist, right? And it could be that there might be mechanisms by which, even though they compete, you know, minimizing the levels of competition between species might be favored. And so a lot of things we'll be talking about what leads to species outcompeting others and driving others to extinction in environments, and what leads to coexistence. And so we'll be looking at kind of the joint population dynamics. And we're going to have another one, even more complicated, competition equation, Lotka-Volterra competition equations. And again, I'm going to derive the equations and how I get those equilibrium points. I'll give you a homework problem where I'll give you the 4 variables, you plot them, and you can tell me what the outcomes are, and I'll give you chances to do that, okay? But again, I'm not going to ask you to derive these equilibrium points, but I do want you to understand these graphs. And so, but let me just, today I thought to myself, do I really want to launch into competition isonclines? And I decided not to. So let's just introduce you to competition. And these are, people are studying how interspecific competition limits the availability or the presence or absence of species in any kind of environment. So basic thing we're talking about is competition between species often limits where species are found. And what we often find is there are certain environments where one species is a better competitor than the other. There may be alternative environments where the other species is a better competitor. And this is often what we see. So this is a classic example of these. This was a study done in Britain a long time ago where they grew these 2 different kinds of plants. And you go into, they're not the barren, I can't remember what they call them. They're not the barrens, I can't remember. These are environments in Britain, even in Ireland, where you have what are called calcareous soils and real acidic soils. And so the key environmental difference that we're looking at in these 2 different species is whether they grow on calcareous soils or whether they grow in acidified soils, okay? And there are 2 species that are involved here, saxatile and sylvestre. Okay, so again, I sort of led into the, you know, exclusion experiments, presence or absence of one species or presence of both species. This is how we often attribute, how do we determine one species is a better competitor than the other in particular environments? So let's kind of go through this. Okay, so this is the case where this was all done in an experimental common garden where they have none of these variables, this was all done in an experimental garden, equal sun, rain, temperature for each group of plants, each species of plants, okay? And the conditions under which they're growing. All that varied was the kind of soil they grew in. Okay, so let's look at this example. The saxatile, this is the species that grows best in acid peaty soils as observed in nature. So this is the case where saxatile is grown alone in calcareous soils or acidic soil. The size of the dots represents how many they were, how big they were, I don't know what it means. But basically what this means, when they're grown alone, which environment do they grow best in? The acidic soils. They grow, but they don't grow as well, they don't produce as many flowers, they really have reduced growth. The other species, Sylvestre, it is actually in nature found in these calcareous environments and not in the acidic soils. Where does it grow best? In the calcareous soils. They don't grow as well in the acidic soil when that's the only variable that differs, okay? Now, what happens when you put, this is where, these are environments where there's no competition between the species. They're grown alone. So the only thing that's occurring here is intraspecific competition. Then they did an experiment in the greenhouse in both environments, calcareous soil and acidic soil, where both species were planted together. And this is the case where you have interspecific competition. Who won? And did it depend? Well, it turns out when the two are planted together, Sylvestre prevails on the calcareous soils. These are the black dots. They're bigger. They outcompeted Saxostyle in the calcareous soils. What happened in the acidic soils? Just the opposite. Saxostyle prevailed on the acidic soils. Okay? So does the outcome of competition depend? Yeah, it depends on the soil. And what you can imagine, what do you think is true about Sylvestre in terms of calcareous soils? And again, you don't have to worry about the details, but they probably have some adaptations, right, that allow them to thrive and persist and grow in these calcareous soils, whereas the other species has adaptations to deal with acidic soils and to survive and grow better relative to the other one, okay? So this is the case where would you, and obviously where do you see these species in nature? Which one predominates in acidic soil? Saxostyle. And again, I'm not going to ask you to remember which one's Saxostyle and which species, but one of them survives well in acidic soils and persists, and that's where it's found. And it outcompetes that one species in acidic soil, but the other species outcompetes the other one in the calcareous soils. Okay. So that would be a case where at some level, I don't know what you call that. They kind of coexist, but not really. They have to coexist in different environments, okay? Okay, this is gonna kind of lead into how we think about how one species can exclude another species from an environment. And this may apply to the Saxostyle in particular kinds of environments. Okay. So the idea here is we're going to, again, talk about these sorts of things. So along here, we think about resource availability, okay? And what we're saying here is these are sort of the resource levels needed to support species A and B. And basically so I don't think I want to go into this. Let's forget this one. Okay. We'll forget that one. It's too complicated and doesn't make a whole lot. It's going to be way too complicated to understand. So ignore that one. Okay. So let's talk about what we mean by resources. And there are lots of things we can talk about when we talk about resources. And these are the things that species are going to be competing over. Okay? Some of them are renewable and some are non-renewable. Okay. So when we think about, if you look at this, this is a picture of a bunch of sort of marine invertebrates in sort of intertidal zones that live on hard rocks and things like that, depending on where you are, right? And so here you can see some sort of barnacles, you can also see mussels, all sorts of things. And what's different about these two sort of environments here? Yeah, the density, right? You can see here that this is an extremely packed, highly dense aggregation of these marine invertebrates. Here you see a lot more spaces sort of between individuals, okay? So obviously one of the most critical things that species, especially marine invertebrates and all sorts of things, are competing over is space, okay? And space is an extremely important thing in terms of competition. And what you can see here is that it's hard to tell necessarily here, but this could be over time. This is what it's like early on, and it eventually goes to this level. And if you had to look at this, guess which species is sort of dominating over time in terms of monopolizing these spaces and growing into them? Do you think it's this one or these smaller ones? It actually turns out to be a lot of these bigger ones. They often tend to be better competitors. They grow faster. They often overgrow things and competitively exclude by monopolizing this space. So this is especially important in terms of things like that. We also have, obviously, renewable resources are going to be things like food, right? all sorts of things that we can deplete, but they might come back. They would be renewed and those sorts of things. So we're going to be looking at all kinds of resources and things and how competition occurs over these shared resources. Okay. Let me just, this is again one of the classic examples of sort of competition that was done. And again, it's kind of showing what we did previously. There are two paramecia. When you grow them together, when you grow them separately, their population density goes up. Is it exponential, or does it reach some sort of carrying capacity, right? Yeah. So when they're grown in isolation by themselves, they basically go to their respective carrying capacities, and it's pretty similar between the two, okay? Now, when you grow them in mixed culture, when you put them both in the same environment, do you get what happens? Well, this particular species basically goes to extinction, and the other one goes to its carrying capacity. So here is the case where you have competitive exclusion. P. caudatum died out, this one right here in the red, died out in the presence of P. aurelia, and obviously the inference would be that somehow that is a better competitor for some sort of shared resource. Again, what is that shared resource? What do you think it is? It's probably food, because Paramecium are vagile or motile. They're feeding on stuff in the water column. So this one is probably somehow better at monopolizing the food resources and ingesting food at a higher rate and basically causing the other one to decline. And so it can survive and outcompetes the other one. Okay. So again, what we're going to do, and I'm not going to launch into this, is we're going to basically remember the logistic equation. Remember that one that we used where instead of increasing exponentially, it stabilizes? And remember we introduced the carrying capacity. Okay. So all we're going to do with these Lotka-Volterra interspecific competition equations is actually just add a term to that includes the effect of the other species. So when you think about where just one species is growing and it reaches an equilibrium at the carrying capacity, what that means is there's intraspecific competition going on for a shared resource, right? And so that the population stabilizes at some value because there's a resource that's limiting. Okay. So what we're saying here, basically what happens, if you look at the exponential rate of increase as a function of population density, basically it goes down as you approach the carrying capacity. Decreasing per capita growth rate expresses the influence of what we call intraspecific competition, right? So when you're at low density, right, the exponential rate of increase is really high because there's little competition. There aren't many individuals of the same species competing over that, limiting resources. But as the population density grows up, the exponential rate of increase goes down, and eventually when n equals k, the growth rate of the population is 0. So when we reach the carrying capacity, whatever that value is, that basically means the population is not changing over time. It's reached the carrying capacity, and it reaches that stable value. Okay, so all we're going to do next time is take that equation. I don't think I did it. Yeah. So if you have time, if you want to, you don't have to. I put on Moodle the competition handout that I use to derive the zero growth competition isoclines. And I'm going to go through one of those probably. I'm going to show you how we take that, modify the logistic equation to add a species into, that's the other competitive species, and then we'll get these 4 outcomes. And the key take-home message is I got to get you to the point where hopefully by lab you'll understand what competition isoclines are, and we're going to put species 1 and species 2 isoclines together and see what the outcome is. The outcome is always going to be either one species goes extinct or you get coexistence. So that's what we'll be focusing on. So what I'll do is I'll talk about that. We'll launch into the competition handout with the isoclines, and then we'll talk about some examples of it. Okay. You want to turn in your homework? And I'll just briefly go over the answers. everybody's names on it. Everybody got it turned in? Okay. What was the answer? What was R? What was R for the Mediterranean? 0.09, right? What was the arid? Good, okay. So how would you describe that population growth rate? I may not even ask you. What did I say? It's positive, but it's pretty close to being stable, isn't it? It's pretty close. It's really probably not significantly different from 0, right? So they're both, they're both positive, but not much above 0. So they seem to be probably at a fairly, stable. Was that how it was when rabbits were first introduced to Australia? Was that the population growth rate you think you got when they were introduced, when 12 rabbits were introduced? No. It was estimated to be about 2.5 or 3.0 at that point. So that measure of intrinsic growth rate of the population has gone down a lot, and it's actually reached a fairly stable value, and there are lots of things that influence that. Okay. Yes?
So if it's on the test, do you want us to classify it as positive, but very close to stable?
Yeah, you'll get it either way. Yeah. And again, I don't have any measures of the variability around those estimates to say, oh, that's significantly different from 0 or not, but
in your notes, you said as long as it's above 0.
Yeah, as long as it's above 0, the absolute value, you can say it's positive. Yep. Slightly positive, barely positive, something like that. Okay. Okay, so what happened though? So here, when you graph those things, what struck you? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So really, I mean, did I do that? So there's the value. I panicked this morning because I couldn't find the graph, so I had to draw it by hand. I didn't have time to do the Excel. So here's what you should have found. Which environment had higher mortality at any age? The Mediterranean, right? Really high mortality, or low survivorship, however you want to think of it. That line is always below the arid population. And despite that, what was its growth rate? It was slightly higher, right? It was 0.09 versus 0.06. How did that happen? As you said, what they did is, what did they do in terms of early fecundity? Birth rates. They really, they compensated for that extremely high mortality by increasing the, fecundity at much earlier ages. This kind of ties into life history, right? That the compensation for this high mortality is emphasis on much earlier reproduction, much higher reproductive effort at earlier ages. So you can see the birth rates are much higher at 9 and 15 in the Mediterranean population compared to the arid population. Okay, so that's kind of what I was looking for. Did everybody did you get, that made sense? Okay, okay, so, okay, hopefully everybody got, what did I say it was worth? 15, okay, so. So that was the kind of the key to tie that really low survivorship is counteracted by emphasis on earlier, higher reproduction. Okay.